So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this is a bit of a rarity because this is a scenario that has been made by Heath Horton, and as anyone who's been watching the channel for a longer period of time may know, he was someone who made quite a few scenarios for me back when my channel was sort of first establishing itself within the space. So it's nice to see whenever he does chip back into the map making scene, and as I've said, in this current version of the game it really is these all new custom maps and scenarios that are going to be keeping us, well, tiding us over really, until the new patch comes out. So it's good to see yet another one. This map or scenario is called Borlak, and I think it's going to be, as is the typical style, a rather large selection of orcs, and it's actually going to be two forces of evil men which are going to be on the defence. Canned have marched a long way, because certainly in terms of colour palette and the rest of the factions on the field, they would appear to be fairly out of place. They've come a long way, but Rhudaur and Canned are going to be on the defence, and it's going to be 4 armies of the attackers against only the 2 armies of the defenders. So we'll see if this defensive position is going to be enough to give them the edge they need to maybe go on to win this particular battle. I mean, it's very fortified. It may look kind of open, and from a ranged unit perspective maybe that's true. However, based on how condensed the map is and how the pathways leading through it are probably going to be fairly narrow, maybe the 2 armies do stand a decent enough chance. But we'll go through the attacking forces first and foremost. We're going to be here with Tuck the Gamer, who's playing as Angmar. Angmar, of course, a priceless faction to have available to you when you're on the attack because of their strength when it comes to brute force attacks, and also their ability to keep themselves alive under a fair amount of pressure, although against their former minions in Rhudaur that's less the case, with all of the armour-piercing projectiles Rhudaur do have access to. Trolls, on the other hand, are going to be a bit of a danger to the lighter units from both Canned and Rhudaur. They've got enough armour-piercing between the 2 of them to make sure the Trolls do drop quickly, but Angmar, of course, choose when and where the Trolls actually get committed, and if they're wise, they will do it at the right time. Angmar halberds as well. Both of the defending forces will have access to better pole arms than this, of course, but it still helps to have an anchor on the front line. The armour piercing, not going to be quite as useful as it would be against the usual Western Kingdoms of men that Angmar face, but still, any sort of pole arm is better than none when it comes to propping up your assault. Fully upgraded Guardians of Khan Doom, they're of course going to be on the front line, and the big shield value, the armour upgrade, all of that sort of thing makes the Guardians of Khan Doom the ideal line infantry unit for attacking in many ways. They may lack a little bit in terms of damage in comparison to other units that the game has to offer, but generally speaking, we've seen the merits of the Guardians of Khan Doom several times in the past. We have the Bodyguard Sword and Shield unit as well here, the Witch Realm Blackguard, which are one of the more dependable units of this type in the game. Of all the types of bodyguard units you can have, this is probably the least spectacular sword and shield bodyguards, but they are going to not let you down as long as you commit them as part of a general assault. They will keep themselves alive for a good long period of time. I do like the look of the Witch Realm Blackguard as well, sort of mimicking their overlord and the Witch King of Angmar. Yeah, really, really cool design, I think. Guardians of Khan Doom as well, once again, armour upgrade, the centre of the Angmaran efforts here, you would say, several units of them. There's also a fair number here of the Angmar Marauders, so they're not going to be able to rely only on their mid to upper tier units, as Angmar often do when they're allowed to pick their own armies rather than it be a custom scenario. But the Angmar Marauders, numerous, not particularly great in melee, but numbers are a quality all of their own here, especially when you outnumber the enemy army by 2 whole armies. Having extra numbers within each individual unit is only going to press home that advantage further. We'll see if the choke points, however, prove to be too much for the Angmar Marauders, who of course have got low morale as well. And then way over here at the back, another armour upgraded unit here in the Witch Realm Scourge Raiders. Throwing axes, going to be useful for busting through those defensive positions which the defenders are inevitably going to take up on that hill. However, throwing projectiles, you would definitely give the edge to Rhudaur in such ways. Excuse me. Anyway, we have the Misty Mountains, played by Hammer. Heavy Goblin Infantry, very similar to the Angmar Marauders. Not going to be too great in terms of their overall effectiveness individually, but it's the numbers that really set them apart here, and especially with the Heavy Goblin Infantry, 253 per unit. Plenty of them to die, but that also means that obviously resources are being expended one way or another in finishing off these very numerous units. We have the Mountain Uruk host here also, an upper tier unit of line infantry, similar to how the Guardians of Khan Doom offset against the Angmar Marauders, so too do the Mountain Uruk host offset against the heavy goblin infantry. The main difference between those two, however, is the Mountain Uruk host are going to be better at dealing damage and that sort of thing. They're going to be more adept at killing enemy units, but they are also going to be a little bit more fragile. You can see just from their shields that they are going to be a little bit more exposed to damage, but they are still a reasonably robust unit, so they will still be able to fill the same role. And like I said, the extra damage will certainly help, especially against the likes of basic Rhudaur units, which don't have the best defensive stats. A couple more units of Mountain Uruk hosts, 3 more units in fact. We've seen in the past the Black Uruks of the mountains be a surprisingly effective unit. They of course don't have a front-facing shield, so projectiles can be a little bit of a problem for them, and they should be a problem for them. If the defenders are wise, this is one of the units they will be focusing down because they're numerous and fairly effective. But yeah, we've seen them be good in the past, and they are one of the Misty Mountains' ways of trying to level off against higher quality factions and trying to give them a better fight in melee, and often they succeed at that, even if they don't outright win. A couple of units of Black Uruks. We've got some heavy goblin halberds as well, once again a unit that is very, very similar to the Angmar equivalent we've already seen in the Angmar halberdiers, so they're going to be on the front line there. We've got the White Uruk fearmongers, which is an upper tier unit of polearms, again halberdier class, so they may very well end up getting outranged by pikes that Rhudaur have access to, but the fearmongers, very, very effective at what they do, provided they don't get outranged or shot up. They're a very, very good anti-armour polearm unit. So we shall see. Another sword and board bodyguard unit. On an individual level, the Goblin King's bodyguard are not going to be as tough as the Witch Realm Blackguard, but there are more of them, and as we saw in the knockout tourney way back when, that is enough to actually mean they win one-on-one versus many other bodyguard units of the same class, even though you may not expect them to. In real battle situations, though, you very rarely see 1v1s of that nature, and so having more numbers is still going to be a good thing, because it means there's simply going to be more of them in the giant mosh pit that forms. And we also have a couple of units of heavy goblin archers, so it looks like there's going to be no crossbows, which is good news for the defenders certainly. The heavy goblin crossbows can often be a real pain to deal with. Heavy goblin archers, on the other hand, are really just here to make up the numbers. It does mean that the defenders won't be able to just sit there and use their ammunition completely freely. The attackers will have the opportunity to put some pressure on them with such units, but yes, heavy goblin archers should be easily dealt with from afar, but they can waste a few resources. More heavy goblin infantry. The cave troll drummers, in this version of the game, of course, the troll drummers are actually non-functional, so they are entirely a aesthetic unit, really, especially seeing as amongst the trolls they are by far the weakest in melee. In the upcoming version of the game, that is not the case. When the new patch comes out, the troll drummers will be functional, but for all this time, of course, as I have mentioned before, it's been a while since we've seen them, but the troll drummers are not working as intended. So there we have it. There is one unit way out in front over here, a single unit of heavy goblin infantry from King Arthur. Would King Arthur play as the Misty Mountains? I don't know about that, but regardless, he is today. We've got several units of Mountain Uruk host, looking like a slightly more high tier army, this one, though a little bit smaller in nature. Several units of Mountain Uruk host, so when this column arrives, the defenders will be placed under that much more pressure. Rhudaur in particular don't really have an equivalent line infantry unit to this. Can kind of do, but even still, the having a bit of extra quality in these Orcish units is going to be an interesting thing to try and overcome. More Black Uruks of the mountains, as we've already mentioned. Those two-handed swords will be very useful indeed. We've got some heavy goblin spears. Under normal circumstances, they'd be far and away the most efficient choice for a frontline combatant. Not so much the case on this occasion. Armour piercing is not the be-all and end-all, especially against Rhudaur. Slightly more useful against Canned, but even there, it's not going to be hyper-efficient in the way that it usually is. But they are going to keep themselves alive better than heavy goblin infantry, so the Misty Mountains definitely have that in their favour. Another one of those units which has a tendency to hide within the game files. It's not part of the general Misty Mountains roster anymore. The Mountain Uruk Archers used to be a unit that the Misty Mountains could pick way back when, and it gave them a slightly stronger archer unit than the heavy goblin archers that we've already seen. But still, you would prefer the crossbows even now if you were the Misty Mountains, but it does give you a little bit more damage at long range. We'll see how they get on. Meanwhile, further back, more heavy goblin infantry with the Goblin King's bodyguard in and amongst them, and there's also some heavy goblin halberds there as well. We have yet more heavy goblin infantry too, and an example of a mounted unit as well, the Warg Riders. Don't know if Rhudaur or Khand have got mounted units on the field today, we shall wait and see. But Warg Riders will be pretty good at hunting them down depending upon how high tier they are. The Rhudaur and Khandish Knights would be enough to take out the Warg Riders, but any single HP cavalry will easily be dealt with by Wargs. And finally, for the attackers, we have Diego Rio Ramos. It's actually been a little bit of time since I got an all-new replay with him in it, so it's good to see. Heavy Goblin Infantry, 3 units of such. We have another unit of Heavy Goblin Infantry in behind. More Mountain Uruk Host, adding that extra quality, which is going to be, I think, the core of the attacking effort today. The amount of Mountain Uruk Host they have is going to be a really good litmus test of how strong this unit is, marching into a pretty disadvantageous situation. Are they going to have the strength to be able to force their way through regardless? Goblin Archers as well, Heavy Goblin Archers at that. We've got the Black Uruks the Mountains, a second unit of Heavy Goblin Archers. More Cave Troll Drummers, of course, which are really just there for aesthetic purposes, as I've already mentioned. A couple of units of Halberdiers, and at the back, another unit of Goblin King's Bodyguard. There could be hidden units, there could be Blackback Berserkers hidden in amongst there, there could be Mountain Orc Berserkers as well, locked morale units from the Misty Mountains. It's hard to say. That will increase their effectiveness in terms of their armies significantly, but probably not too much. Looking at the amount of units they have, there's not too much space left in their roster, so it's not as if we're going to be seeing tons and tons of units suddenly appear. Meanwhile, for the 2 defenders, Unknown Riddler is playing as Rhudaur. He's got some upgraded Rhudaur Clansmen, an effective line holding unit, especially with that armour upgrade. They've got a big shield, so enemy arrows are not going to be as effective against them, and spearmen tend to be pretty good on the defence anyway, and these Rhudaur spears have got slightly better offensive stats as well, so that's worth bearing in mind. 2 units of Rhudaur Berserkers. When they're outnumbered by 2 armies, they are entitled to a bit of extra quality, so having more than a single bodyguard unit per class is very nice for them. Throwing axes, not too much ammunition on them, but still effective projectiles, and then they're very dangerous in melee as well with those armour-piercing attacks of theirs. Rhudaur Swordsmen, highly functional sword unit. They are slightly stronger than the likes of the Angmar Marauders and the Heavy Goblin Infantry, but not by much, so they can't rely on this unit to be too domineering in the melee fight, especially when some of the stronger units like the Black Uruks and the Mountain Uruk Host and the Guardians of Khan Doom come after them. They're really just going to be making up the numbers then and holding the line, hoping that other units can do the damage for them. But Rhudaur Pikemen, as we've already mentioned, pikes are something which seems to be lacking on the attacking force today. The Witchround Pikemen are not on the field for Angmar, and the Misty Mountains only have access to Halberdiers. So having the extra range on pikes, especially a really solid unit of pikes like the Rhudaur Pikemen here, is going to be a very useful thing for helping to defend the settlements in the corner of the map. There are Black Wolds in and amongst here, obviously a Berserker class unit with tons of damage. Rhudaur Marksmen, plenty of ammunition, so ammunition count may very well be important. It dramatically increases the maximum amount of damage that the Rhudaur Marksmen can actually do. Rarely do we see that. They often either get killed or the battle is over before then, but still, elongated skirmishing is the sort of thing which they can engage in. Ettenmore's Troll Hunters, throwing projectiles for Rhudaur, are very, very important, of course. Better armour than most Rhudaur units. The Javelins are going to be vital when it comes to breaking up the assaults as well. And they do have the Knights, they do have the Rhudaur Nobles, so as much as there is a unit of Wargs on the field, the armour upgraded Rhudaur Nobles will still have the beating of them, especially if they can get a charge first and foremost with their Knights. This could be a very effective unit indeed. I believe there are a few more pockets of Rhudaur units out here as well, which are probably hidden based on the deployment zones that I saw at the start anyway. And finally we have the Flame of Arnor, who is playing as Khand, already in position in the settlement. So we have the Veriag Cataphracts, another unit of Lance Knights, significantly heavier, you'd have to say, than the Rhudaur Nobles, so maybe the longevity will be more important. But as long as they have these 2 units of Knights, and as long as they do a decent amount of heavy lifting charging into some slightly more vulnerable units, they should be just fine, and should be a very important part of their defence. Meanwhile, the defensive position, Nurad Footmen, I imagine we're going to be seeing them be a really central part of the defensive efforts today. Very nice unit of line infantry, big shield value, nice armour piercing attacks as well, and armour piercing is going to be very useful for the defenders against the attackers today, so Khand will find themselves in a good place, and so too will Rhudaur, depending on what sort of hidden units they've got to offer. Speaking of which, nomadic axemen, I mean, as far as a defensive unit goes, they are going to die off pretty quickly. They're going to be vulnerable to missiles. Their melee defense is pretty lacking. But they do have armor-piercing attacks, so as part of a combined arms front line, they could still be very, very useful and efficient parts of the front line. If you're building your own army with your own budget, then that could be the reason for bringing them, though in a custom scenario you have to just make do with what you have, so that is how the Flame of Arnor is going to have to utilise them today. We have a couple of units of Brotherhood of the Spear, so going into the red limit on the Brotherhood units means you're going to have a lot of high-end, though not quite bodyguard tier quality, and the Brotherhood of the Spear are going to be fantastic for holding a line like that. Big shield value, better defensive stats all round, including in armour, than much of the other aspects of the Candish roster. Very, very nice indeed. More polearms as well. The Nurad Halberds, canned another faction that don't have access to pikes, but you still want a phalanx unit in and amongst your defence regardless of that, and the Nurad Halberds will do that for canned. We have nomadic infantry, which as far as skirmishing archers go are one of the, well, a really good choice. They can also get involved in the melee fights as well. They're very similar to something like the Balakith marksman from Umbar or the Bardian marksman from Dale. They can't have the armour upgraded like those two units can, but they're very similar in the sense they're intended to be a really solid archer in a skirmish fight, and then they can also chip in melee when all is said and done. Although their abilities in melee, all of those kinds of units are slightly below par for that functionality, I would suggest. But they will be useful on this occasion where everything is going to have to get involved in the melee fights at some point. Variag Bowman with the armour upgrade as well, probably the more efficient of the two units to pick. There's slightly more of them per unit, they're also slightly cheaper, but that is by the by in a custom scenario, as I've already mentioned. We have some upgraded Variag warriors, very similar actually to the Black Uruks of the mountains on the other side of the field, only there are less of them, so even though you can upgrade the armour, I would much prefer 40 extra combatants than upgraded armour on this occasion, considering the similarities between the two units anyway. Brotherhood of the Sword and Shadows, so this is going to be a unit which pretty good in an elongated fight, as long as they don't get shot up. Brotherhood of the Shadows, like most assassin class units, are a little bit underwhelming perhaps for what they are, but again we'll see how they do. The Storm Guard are by far and away the most impressive Candish infantry unit, and when they dig in and are part of these, well, are the centre of the defence, Cand should be pretty good at holding the line, and it's kind of hard to tell actually where the pathways are in this settlement based on the fortifications that have been dug, but yes. We also have more Nurad Halberds. We've got some floating walls, but I guess they've been put up as makeshift fortifications. We've got some Brotherhood of the Axe and some Nomadic Warriors, so most of the Candish roster is here today, which is good to see, or at least most of the infantry roster, though don't know how effective their front line's going to be with a limited number of Nurads, but we shall see. The cavalry is going to get things underway first and foremost, I would imagine, so without further ado, let's get this show on the road, shall we? Having a look at the deployment zones at the start of this battle as well, I do believe there are going to be a few hidden pockets of goblins as well as some elements of the Rhudaur army starting to pop into existence, including the Ferodrum javelins you see there and the Trollshaw axe throwers, so plenty more in the way of throwing projectile punch and some Rhudaur axemen as well, so yeah, plenty of armour piercing as perhaps you would expect. The Variad cataphracts also sweeping out across the field to try and help guide the Rhudaur army in, and I suspect that any sort of goblin regiments that are hidden will do so with the aim of trying to delay Rhudaur so that the other armies can catch up to them. Some heavy goblin infantry very rapidly moving backwards. That one unit that was placed out in front maybe will live to regret that unless there are some hidden units of anti-cavalry nearby. Speaking of which though, here we have the one unit of goblin infantry that is going to try and stand in the way. I think there is slightly more than just this. Let's go down to half speed for just a moment, as the goblin infantry will stand in the way. A few more units revealing themselves. I mean, they do have the armour upgrade, but it should be an easy enough task for Rhudaur to do the business here, especially with the Variag cataphracts turning around and charging into the goblin infantry there. There are a few more units revealing themselves as well, so I mean, if nothing else, this does go to show the amount of extra manpower that is now all of a sudden on the field, with several units of 250 goblin infantry hoving into view. But I can't imagine they're going to last all that long, considering that over here, already seeing them routing with still over 200 of them left. And I guess this is the problem with having a force like this all on its lonesome, trying to make something happen when their morale is so poor and when their individual abilities are so poor as well, and they're being asked to go up against stuff like Rhudaur Berserkers. Never going to end all that well for them, and indeed nothing more than a speed bump. Rhudaur in many ways actually didn't even stop, they just went barreling right through with several units already advancing. Goblin infantry getting charged by the Black Wolves over here as well, and that most assuredly is not going to end all that well for that. The charge bonus connecting rather nicely. Still, the Goblin infantry that is with the heavy Goblin infantry a little bit further back will be somewhat more useful because it can link up with the main armies and simply act as more manpower in trying to wrest control of the settlement away from the defenders here. But yeah, not too effective as far as an initial force goes. Don't know what's going on over here. These Rhudaur units turning back around. I think this is a result of when you select your whole army and send them in a direction, some of them for some reason decide to go the other way. Classic medieval too. Surely not going to be too much of a problem, and of course they can feast upon these kills, padding out the kill count a little bit more of the Variag Cataphracts, though we will need to bear that in mind for later on, because these are not going to be all that important in the grand scheme of things. More effective kills are going to be required. And yeah, those Goblin infantry easily getting swept up now. Angmar on the way forwards though, so they do need to be a little bit careful. Angmar will probably decide to go from this angle first and foremost, rather than trying to effect Rhudaur's passage back into the settlement. But Rhudaur by far represent the bigger ranged threat of the two defending factions here. They've got access to rangers, which they are here, revealing themselves. Plenty of those javelins as well, throwing axes. Standard archers you'd give the slight edge to Canned, but those really are more of a functional unit than anything else. All of the real showstoppers from an attacking perspective are in Rhudaur's possession. Meanwhile, I don't know entirely what's going on over here, and once again, these units, I guess they're kind of lucky here, that they're very lucky in fact that the Warg Riders didn't decide to charge forward with a little bit more gusto. Probably would attract the attention of the Variag Cataphracts, but honestly the Wargs are not going to be that useful for doing anything than trying to pick off stragglers in the open field. When it comes to trying to take over the settlement on the hill, the Warg Riders are going to be only really good for maybe a mass push at the end if the attackers have built up a decent lead for themselves. But we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. Would not be the first time. Orc Fellas revealing themselves, so more armour piercing. A lot of Orc Fellas in fact alongside the Angmar Marauders, so definitely more of a numbers focused Angmar army this. And that is how Horton does like to make his scenarios, with very large Orc armies attacking. And that is a little bit of a difference in what we usually see from Angmar, as I've already mentioned in the composition phase. Angmar, if you are allowed to pick your own factions, generally speaking people will go for the mid-tiers on upwards and really fully focus around that. The Warg Riders are marching forward now, but I wouldn't really recommend going after 2 units of Knights. Like I said, the time has now passed. Being more decisive with the Wargs might have made things a little bit different, and perhaps they, backing up the Goblin infantry, would have made for a more effective delaying measure for Rhudaur as the march forward continues. Still quite a long ways off actually, King Arthur's Goblin army and Diego Rio Ramos's Goblin army, though we may see Guardians of Kharndoom a little bit further off. All of these fortifications floating in mid-air, but really this is, all of these stakes and the like represent impassable terrain, so I do wonder actually which elements of this terrain is actually passable. I mean, I think you can just go straight over this hill, so that would be the best way, and then maybe splitting off some units to go around that way as well. Can you get over through this way? If you can, I think it would end up being more of an oversight than anything else, but I don't think you are actually able to go that way because of the red line. Obviously one of those examples where the red line is the reason why units can simply go around defences rather than anything else. Yeah, with how sort of hodgepodge the fortifications actually are in this battle, I do wonder where the attackers actually will be able to advance. I mean, we can see the path that Rhudaur are taking now. It's a very, very steep approach from the front here. So fatigue may very well start to play a part in this battle as well as it advances. Cataphracts moving forward. Well, I mean, the Wargs, they do actually manage to somehow pick off some stragglers in the end, managing to get a charge into the back of these Rhudaur Axemen. Certainly better than nothing. One has to wonder why the Rhudaur Axemen were not retreated a little bit more quickly than this, because they were definitely just sort of stood there and then were revealed from being hidden. Meanwhile, the same sort of thing is now happening over here with Hammer's army starting to arrive. The Goblin Archers trying to get into position to start shooting into the defences, but the Cataphracts bumping into them, interrupting them as they do so. Though not the most effective charge, you have to say, and a combination of Warg Riders and a few Archer shots, maybe the sort of thing which can make the Veriag Cataphracts reject, or regret, I should say, not reject. I can't deny it ever happened, but regret that decision. Brotherhood of the Spear moving into position as well as the first unit, so not going to give them an easy time of it. Surely going over this hill is the best choice. And you can definitely go over that. Angmar occupying the area around that watchtower would be the way to go, I think. And they've got plenty of numbers to deliver to the enemy there. Nice position for the Rhudaur Rangers though, and I do think that as the most dangerous, the most obvious weakness in this defensive position, the Rangers should be focusing on it, because that represents the best amount of damage that the defenders can do. Is there a way up over here as well? Doesn't look like it. So there are only two ways in. There's the narrow way in over here, but then it sort of splits off into two ways up a very, very steep hill. And then there's the way over the hill over there. It's a very weird position terrain-wise, this one. Nomadic infantry with an initial shot, but by the looks of things, that was merely because they were on fire at will. Based on, I mean, as soon as the other armies arrive, we will surely see a fairly aggressive push forwards. Guardians of Khand Dûm on the way as well. Being the first unit in would probably be for the best. I mean, you could send heavy Goblin infantry in, but I think it makes more sense to actually establish yourself on the front line first before simply throwing away low tier units. And ranged units going after the nomadic axemen. Is this really a good enough reason to pull back from this position right away and contract the map even further? I'm really not convinced it is. Not the most sporting behaviour, that, I must be honest. I mean, it is a 2v4, so you've got to take what advantages you can, I suppose. But again, I'm never really the biggest fan of it when the defenders make the map so one-dimensional. When they literally go to literally the last stand with pretty much everything they have, and then it just becomes a slog to the end. And I fear that's what we're going to be getting here, unfortunately. Again, it's probably the more effective thing to do. So if you're going for the win, fair enough. But from my perspective, obviously, when I'm showing the battle off, I want it to be a little bit more interesting than that. We've got the archers slowly on the way forwards, and still the goblins. I don't really know why the goblins are taking so long to get over here either. There's no real need to take your time this much by like stopping your army fully as it marches forwards. Guardians of Khand Dûm now with no units nearby to potentially counter-attack into them. They can very easily just move up onto this little hill and occupy it. That's going to be an absolute nightmare of a position to try and take. These nomadic axemen have got no way to retreat either, so they've been retreated back over here, but they're going to be destroyed. Of course, the downside to retreating like this is you're so condensed that any attacking archers are just going to fire into your defensive position and they're going to get some sort of value, which is exactly the sort of thing you want to be avoiding as the defenders if you're outnumbered by 2 clear armies. Sniper Stalkers leading the way. But now it turns into effectively a 2 choke point battlefield, and one of the choke points is extremely difficult to get up. And this one is a little bit more open, and I think the attackers are actually doing the right thing here by trying to first and foremost soften the enemy up with a few volleys from their archers. Just in behind, the Brotherhood of the Spear still represent a really, really strong frontline combatant. Still, the Misty Mountains drag their heels. That unit of Nomadic Axemen will manage to retreat. They could have probably stopped that from happening, actually. The attackers showing far too much quarter to the enemy there for my liking. And so far just them. I mean, the Frontline Rangers are now revealing themselves, so this seems a little bit early actually for them to be doing so. I mean, there's a decent blob of units over here, but nothing too important. Maybe just letting the attackers know they can't afford to just stand there without taking losses, which is fair enough, but to use the Rangers for that seems a little strange. Surely they're not going to retreat from this position as well. Like, come on. There's not even a better position to retreat to. Putting the nomadic units on the front line, which could be a little bit of a risk. I would have thought that having a unit of Murad halberds would be the play. It would attract the attention of the archers, of course, but that I think is going to be unavoidable. Nomadic infantry are going to be trying to fire into the horde as they approach. And the volleys being loosed. Scoring some pretty good hits there, head on. This is where, in the composition phases, I was sceptical over whether the heavy goblin archers would actually be useful in this battle for anything other than making up the numbers, but I guess I'm wrong, given the situation as it is at the moment. Simply whittling down the defenders and making that numbers gap even greater, even if it is only on basic units, is the sort of thing which can be incredibly useful. Nomadic infantry, though, very much at home in a skirmish fight, so it's going to take overwhelming force to finish them off. This unit of heavy goblins as well does have a good shot, but so far the hexagonal shields of the Rhudaur swordsmen seem to be doing their job well enough. Further over here, are we seeing the advancing units? I mean, the drummers would be in a perfect position here if they actually functioned, though of course we know in this version of the game that's not going to be true, but we may very well start to see the first front open up. They are actually being allowed to get up onto the same level to fight as well, the goblins. Interestingly enough, heavy goblin infantry and nomadic warriors, kind of the same thing. Nomadic warriors slightly the stronger of the two units, even with the numbers discrepancy, but so far the defenders, I think they do need to get themselves into slightly more organised shape. Further back down, Angmar marauders, I mean Snaga stalkers, not exactly going to be doing much of any use over there, but this looks a little bit more like it. Overwhelming force to the situation is what you need. The battle has been started. Something like that is likely to finish it unless the defenders send forward reinforcements, so that should be easy enough. One of the benefits to retreating so early is the fact that all of your units are going to be close enough to one another that you can reinforce any failing positions on the front line relatively easily, and there won't be a huge gap between them. That's obviously more so a problem we see with attackers in siege battles like this, though it can affect the defenders as well. Still being softened up before the main event here. For example, those infantry units are still a fair ways off. Relic of the Shadows still in there. Heavy Goblin Infantry will now be reinforced by the Mountain Uruks. And that's going to provide a much greater challenge for the Nomads. The Nomadic Axemen will still be effective against them with that armor piercing, but the level of quality is going to be a pretty large discrepancy in that. Victory is a distinct possibility. More volleys. Angmar, I mean, do Angmar would now be an opportunity to send forward the Great Shield Infantry already? Maybe. This is probably the worst position from an attacking perspective, or the most disadvantageous position for you as attackers. So if you can get past it by using the Blackwatch Legion, even if it cost them their lives, maybe it would be worth your while. You can see here the Mountain Uruk Coast. It still says defeat seems certain. I feel as though that will flip around fairly quickly. Those heavy goblins haven't held up particularly well, you'd have to say. But that's to the surprise of absolutely no one, of course. Nomad footmen marching forwards. Goblin trackers still firing in as well, so still these cheap archers looking to get as much value as they possibly can before the full weight of the attackers starts to move forward. You can see here these Rhudaur marksmen have taken a fair amount of damage in the skirmish fight. A lot of the arrows here have been buried into the grass right in front of them as well, so again, maybe worrying signs this for the defenders. They need more of these units to be used a little bit more effectively than this if they are to have success. Enough quality on the front line that they should be able to put up a reasonable fight, but as we all know, numbers can reach a point where they are kind of impossible to overcome. There's no coast victory is almost a certainty now, so it has flipped around. Blackback Mountain Berserkers have revealed themselves as well, the sort of unit we didn't see in the composition phase so much. But something else which will be very, very concerning for the defenders, and this is why I'm kind of surprised they retreated from this initial position and didn't try to hold on to that hill, because that's a perfect position to shoot down from up here. That would be far more effective. They're going to find it quite difficult to find a good position to shoot into over here. They're going to have to place their archers here perhaps, but even then the terrain is actually covering the attackers a little bit, so I think maybe even retreating, you can even argue that it's actually not effective in some ways, especially seeing as it's going to have to be with their ranged units that the defenders try and impress themselves upon this battle. I don't know. We shall see. Rhudaur marksmen continuing to fire away. We'll see the Misty Mountains very, very deep manpower reserves. And Angmar as well, given their more quantity focused composition here. So plenty of orcs to try and still massacre their way through. And are they going to retreat already? No, it's a rout. Over 100 units. I mean, this is the thing. If you're trying to rely upon these low tier units only, it's why I really wouldn't recommend. This smacks of, again, someone trying to get away with sending cheaper units to the front line. And we're starting to see now the Rhudaur Rangers move in, but yeah, the most dangerous, you would have to say, choke point for the attackers has been broken through already because of the low tier nature of the units that the defenders were trying to get away with sending. And so far I haven't really agreed with anything the defenders have done. Full of all of my pet peeves so far. But we'll see. Plenty of time for them to get into a good position and do a lot of damage with their ranged units, I suppose. Goblin infantry defeat a distinct possibility. So trying to go forward with, again, leading with the lower end units, but there's a lot of them here. Unless you get caught in some manner of chain route, it's not too much of a problem, but you can see now they're having to defend from two different angles very close to one another, and this is the price they pay for trying to get away with using only nomads on the front line. previously. They're going to be forced into action now, the defenders at the very least. They're not going to be able to get away with doing that sort of thing any longer, otherwise this battle will be far shorter than we know it is, thanks to the frames up in the top corner. But now with the blackbacks as well, Brotherhood of the Spear being committed to the front line, more solid Neurads, more swordsmen, Brotherhood of the Axe. It's not the best angle for the Rangers, though they will be able to get a good amount of kills here. What's going on here? Snaga Stalkers moving up the flank. And yeah, the fortifications are funneling. Oof. Well, that's a good position for the Hwacha, and that's going to cause havoc among the attacking morale. So this is the sort of thing which can very much turn the battle around very quickly. I mean, it's very rare actually that you see the Hwacha get kills in such a condensed fashion. It's usually spread out longer, but the angle of fire there, that was a huge amount of kills. The Hwacha, we're going to see that later on, of course, seeing as this battle is from the Khandish perspective. But these are still the problems. I mean, as much as that was very, very effective and a lot of these units are now routing off, there is a gap in the defensive line which these Angmar Marauders are now pouring through. And this is the thing that the attackers need to do now. They just need to keep sending units forward, trying to buckle these front lines, and that will be enough to see them through. Further down, Snaga Stalkers still shaken. And the rockets, again, doing an awful lot of damage. When your front line is made up so heavily of standard Goblin infantry, you know that it's going to be not great for you, to say the least. Angmar Marauders' victory seems certain. And still, sheer weight of numbers here proving to be a real difference maker. Trolls moving forward as well. I agree with the attackers continuing to really go all in. The Hwacha is now actually moving a little bit as well. Brotherhood of the Shadows. You see the units of Angmar Marauders that did force their way through, ultimately broken and fighting to the death as a result of Neurad Stormguard and high tier units moving in. But yeah, barreling forward with Trolls and really consolidating all of these gains that they've made, definitely the important thing as we take in this fight from on high. The defensive lines, at least the initial ones, looking like they're ever more in shambles. Troll Drummers doing the same thing as well. Brotherhood of the Shadows getting a little bit closer. The Neurad Stormguard are the sort of thing which can turn the tide of this battle, and the attackers need to be careful enough. I mean, they need to continue to add fuel to the fire, so to speak. Send forward more and more units, so that this doesn't run out of steam, because that is one way in which the defenders could find their way back into this game. And Brotherhood of the Axe, that armor-piercing damage. The Mountain Host, though, have proven to be a very effective unit so far. More arrow fire. Pikemen sweeping across the hill. Heavy Goblin Spears, like we already mentioned, maybe not going to be as effective in this battle as they otherwise would. Flaming Shot is, I think, a decent idea for the defenders to try and utilise here. Breaking units is something we've already seen be effective, especially where the Hwacha is concerned, but again, the Trolls in behind enemy lines, although in all fairness, the Rhudaur Axemen well placed to deal with Trolls. Although I think, did they kill off the entirety of the Hwacha crew? That would be a fantastic get if they were able to do that, given the extreme amount of damage that it's already subjected them to. No, the Hwacha crew did manage to get away. They're going to have to remount the artillery though when the trolls are gone, and they need to make sure actually that they keep map control of this area now, the defenders, if they hope to maintain control of their own artillery. Oof. Atenwall's Troll Hunters, this is another classic edge to one of these scenarios where you have giant clusters of orcs with projectiles being thrown into them. Even on the new PC, the game is not too enamoured with trying to showcase that, but we do what we can. The second line has been set up as well. Rhudaur Clansmen and Rhudaur Pikemen now starting to run out of steam a little bit over here. I think the attackers, they have taken their foot off the gas pedal a little bit. And as I mentioned, that is one way in which the defenders can start to claw their way back into this fight. Axeman victory, a distinct possibility still against the troll that remains. Troll singular. Throwing axes, finding their way in as well against a lot of these units, especially against the Mountain Orc Berserkers. That level of damage is going to be very, very high. Mountain Orc host, more of them around. I mean, Black Orcs of the mountains, as projectiles get more and more scarce on the battlefields, units like the Black Orcs become more and more valuable for their heightened abilities in melee at the expense of a shield. So lots of flaming shot. Another slew of goblins and mountain orcs are going to be moving forward to try and test this front line, but I have to say the Neurad Stormguard at the head of the efforts. The defenders have managed to lock things down on this front line. Very, very nice. Angmar Halberd's routing, so the flaming shot doing its work as well. Variad Cataphracts waiting for an opportunity perhaps to charge in. I mean, even if the attackers do break through when utilising cavalry, you can reverse that trend. Attackers trying to push their way through over here. Rhudaur Marksmen in a pretty good position if they can actually fire down the enemy units, but oof, that frame rate though. Medieval 2 straining under the weight of this. Watcher crew getting into position once again for yet another volley into these units as they try and push their way up the hill. Guardians of Kharndoom still waiting. Plenty more heavy goblins moving in for now. And with how the momentum has been stifled, and with the sheer amount of physical and mental damage that has been imparted upon the attackers here, this is actually kind of risky, firing over the heads of your own units with the Watcher, because a few of the projectiles may veer off into your own men, but they are firing across the way over here. You can see that it's having, once again, a detrimental effect on attacker morale. Nomadic infantry. So one of the attacking forces struggling, and indeed that's a lot of units that are routing now and continuing to push back against this force. You'd have to say the momentum well and truly in favour of the defenders now. Utilising the Misty Mountains' poor morale against them. Throwing axes, decent angle of fire for them. One thing that's kind of difficult to see in a battle like this, where everything's a little bit chaotic and the frames are struggling a little bit more perhaps, is how well the throwing projectiles are doing. Much easier to see the archers when flaming shot is being employed, but yeah, Ferodrum javelins, Trollshaws out of ammunition, so that's actually a good sign, believe it or not. It's a sign that all the ammunition has been utilised, no danger of any of it going to waste if it has already been expended, and they can just get on the front line being more mass, more meat for the grinder, as it were. Neurad Stormguard victory, a distinct possibility. decent enough damage on the front line still, even with... I mean, actually, to be fair, there's still 64 of them left. It goes to show how strong the Stormguard are in this kind of situation. The attackers have still yet to really make an impression on that unit. Admittedly, it's not exactly been a perfect situation for them over here. Mountain archers, stats-wise, I don't know how they fit into the meta of the game at the moment, because they're from a previous version. I know that this patch has been around for quite a while, but that is an example of a unit that was around before this patch. I don't know, stats-wise, how they stack up. And once again, the Hwatcher causing very high amounts of damage to the attackers, and I think it's fair to say I think the attackers are going to not... well, I don't know actually. I mean, considering the fact that we don't have that many frames left in the battle, it doesn't really seem like the attackers are running out of manpower anytime soon. The defenders still seem reasonably solid on the front line. Polearms still available to them, but I guess you see here Angmar halberds pushing back against the shock infantry that Rhudaur have available to them, and maybe the longevity of Khand and especially Rhudaur being called into question now against such a large force. Rhudaur berserkers, more throwing projectiles being used now. Don't know if that's going to be enough necessarily, but we'll see. Khandish General falls. Was that a Mountain Archer that killed him, or was it one of the Blackback Berserkers that they're fighting alongside? Defeat seems certain for the Narad Stormguard now, which is a worrying sign. Narad Halberds are starting to rout. The loss of that Khandish General causing panic among the ranks. Snaga Stalkers. Units that have returned from routing that can be committed back, and maybe they will be required to. Yeah, Rhudaur pikemen are starting to rout, and with the anchors to those front lines starting to rout off as well, and this is also where being right in the corner of the map doesn't help, because normally 119 pikes probably would return, but they probably will get to the red line before they will. More and more it's becoming apparent that the attackers will almost certainly go on to win this battle. You see one of the Misty Mountains generals in there. Easy to spot from a distance, and now they're routing towards the enemy, which is just as bad, because it means they definitely won't be returning from routing anyway. The Shadow's still there, very Bowman trying to fire in, but pretty much everything being committed now. Cavalry trying to charge in, but there's not really any obvious positions to charge into with lances down, unfortunately. An example of the attackers simply having too much in the tank for the defenders to cope with. Oof, that frame rate there. There's still enough units as well in reserve. Orc fellas revealing themselves. Yeah, the attackers are going to have too much here, unless the defenders can pull out another unit of rangers from somewhere and another significant amount of ranged pressure to put the attackers under. And by significant I mean overwhelming. This is going to end in favour of Angmar and the Misty Mountains, or the spawn of Sauron, to give them their more accurate name from Horton's series of battles, which I guess is still ongoing. It's been ongoing for pretty much since near enough the start of my channel at this point, and here we still are. Blackwall's getting into melee, still 119 of them. You can see that it's more or less at half speed at this point because of the frames being what they are. Again, I do feel as though that this kind of battle, maybe there's no need for the battle to be designed with this in mind, because I can only imagine how horrendous this must have been to play in. Because this is running far more efficiently than it would do if you're actually in the game, when you're taking into account other people's internet connection as well. and the game's limitations when you're actually playing it. Like the frames would be, you'd be able to, it's more like a slideshow really. Here it's still just about okay because it's more or less just half speed basically. But still, I guess it is somewhat nostalgic. This is how scenarios used to be after all, especially on my old PC, which is still in service, but only for use in rendering and uploading the videos, so I'm not having to divert too many resources on the PC I'm currently using to that. But I remember recording such battles on this used to be a bit of a problem. What sort of reinforcements do we have left? I mean, we can see pretty much all of the relevant points on the battlefield now. Rhudaur Berserkers on the front line, Variag Bowmen, are they out of ammunition? I don't know. The Watcher crew moving in, and you can see now that more and more elements of especially the Khandish army with their general gone are starting to rout. And even the Rhudaur units starting to struggle a little bit more. Evil Men factions, of course, their morale is not particularly fantastic. We've seen them exploit the Misty Mountains, very low morale in this battle, but their own less than stellar morale is the reason really why it's been put beyond them here in the latter stages of this one. Guardians of Khandoom in behind enemy lines now. Don't really know why the Variag Bowmen stopped firing. If you want to pad your kill count, that would have been the way to do it. Rhudaur Berserkers still fighting the good fight, and they will get a fair few kills, though. Again, against stuff like Goblin King's Bodyguard and Whiter of Fearmongers. I think that would be, if this was supposed to be a battle where the attackers were simply in overwhelming numbers, then fair enough. But I feel as though if this fight was meant to be one that could have gone either way, I think toning down, honestly, the amount of Mountaineer at coast and upper end Misty Mountains units that the attackers had at their disposal probably would be the way to make it more balanced, because as I kind of alluded to in the composition phase, that amount of Mountaineer at coast was always going to be fairly decisive, I think, and when they came forward fairly early on, the precedent for the battle had really been set. All of those Neurads actually coming back from routing, some of them routing again immediately. Nomadic infantry trying to stop the advance of the Orc fellas. Nomadic infantry. I'm actually surprised there's still any semblance of a front line still fighting. Brotherhood of the Shadows still trying to make something happen. Still a few of those Neurad Stormguard as well. There are only 6 of them at this point. There goes one of the Misty Mountains generals. Cavalry doing its best to make something happen back here. Managing to assassinate one of the generals, and they will at least manage to pad the kill counts a little bit more. Orc fellas, though, as any heavy axeman unit is going to be, even a more lowly one like this, a surprisingly effective anti-cavalry tool in melee. The wargs coming forward. The wargs didn't really do much, but then they didn't really need to, so just a footnote really at the start of the battle. Then it's going to be a pretty domineering victory by the attackers in the end. More routing. Our marksman still alive. Another nice charge by the Rhudaur nobles. Trying to make more and more of a dent in the attackers' manpower. Variag Bowmen sweeping down over the hills to perhaps come to the aid of the nomadic infantry. Defeat seems certain for the Orc fellas, but surely not for long. With all of those units still there, and sheer amount of dead on the front line is very significant at this point. The Rhudaur Berserkers will probably fight to the bitter end, and they are pretty much the only unit on the front line still fighting, as well as actually the Brotherhood of the Shadows as a result of them being pushed past essentially, and they're right up against one of the dips in terrain. Rhudaur nobles are routing, rare enough sight. Do they brush up against halberdiers? Perhaps the wargs actually do manage to get into the Variag cataphracts as well. Pole arms and all sorts of units on the way forwards as well. Variag cataphracts made of slightly sterner stuff mentally by the looks of things. Refusing to rout as they are. And my berserkers. Rhudaur marksmen still fighting over here for Rhudaur. Still those Brotherhood of the Shadows fighting for Khand. I think that's going to be end of the line for the cataphracts too. Not routing though, they are shaken, so they are capable of routing. I'm surprised actually they're not, given the presence of spears and halberds in and amongst here. I mean, I guess there's no point in routing at this point. You're surrounded, you may as well fight to the bitter end. Alright, bowmen routing as well. So actually units that are still fighting on the front line, technically speaking, outlasting units in the backfield, though the frontline berserkers' fate is already sealed, really. White Uruk Fearmongers are there, player admitting defeat, so Khand have admitted defeat, so the Brotherhood of the Shadows will be gone. So it is these berserkers that are the last units left, and I think it will be an admission of defeat actually before they are killed off to the last man. Yeah, and there they go. There is the time limit as well. That was one thing to bear in mind, which is another reason why I'm a little bit surprised why the defenders maybe didn't try to defend from the front a little bit more. I guess the time limit was always the... looking back on it now, I don't know why I didn't mention that, but yes, the time limit would probably have been the thing to give the defenders the victory there. But I was just looking as well. Captain Borlak. Borlak is was the name of the replay. I don't know if it's the name of the map as well. But the name of the Khandish captain, I don't know. It's the sort of thing which I'll have to have a look at in the Discord and in the replay files that Horton himself has sent me. But yeah, nice to see another custom scenario like this. Like I said, it's kind of the lifeblood of the game until the new patch finally drops. And yeah, an interesting one, kind of a bit of a rough around the edges scenario, I would suggest, this one, given the fortifications being what they were, the situation on the front line. I mean, it was a sterling effort in the end, I suppose, by the defenders. I do still think that maybe defending from the front a little bit more so, trying to get away with those nomads early on as well, kind of set the wrong precedent early. And then, as soon as the attackers came forward, they simply maintained that presence, and that was enough in the end to secure victory for them. They already left themselves a little bit too much to do, the defenders, and maybe keeping their cavalry outside of the settlement would have been the thing to do. Again, no crossbows to go after them, so they wouldn't have had to worry about that. Only a single unit of Warg Riders, which between 2 units of Lance Knights they would have been able to deal with just fine. That would have also given them potential to hammer and anvil. They did a good job in doing a lot of damage to morale with Flaming Shot, and especially with the Hwacha, which I'm sure we'll see in just a moment. But still, room for improvement there, and given the map is what it is and the attackers can only advance into you, as the defenders you've got to try and make the most, the absolute most of these sorts of things. And while they did a good job of it, you kind of need to do an exceptional job when you're outnumbered by at least 2 armies. But let's see what did the damage for Khand. Yeah, the Nurad Stormguard did very well on the front line, as you'd expect. There came a moment where they did become overwhelmed, but nearly 600 kills from a single unit of infantry, even a really high tier one like this, is very impressive. 1 unit of Brotherhood of the Spear also getting 1 shy of 260 kills. That's also very good. The other one of the few units actually to not break 100, several units doing very nicely. The Hwacha getting 528, which actually not as much as the Stormguard, but it doesn't count the units that it also caused to rout, so that's probably a fairly significant number as well. Variag Bowman doing nicely, Brotherhood of the Axe doing well, Brotherhood of the Sword doing significantly less well, but then that's kind of to be expected. The Axe often ends up being a far more impressive unit in the long haul. Nomadic units, like we said, not really good enough because they're not really too much better than the equivalent Misty Mountains goblins, and that's a little bit of a problem when you're reliant on quality to try and see yourself over the line. Brotherhood of the Shadows were the last Khandish unit left standing before the admission of defeat. getting around 100 kills, and then over 200 on the other units of archers as well. Variag warriors may be a little bit disappointing as well, but by the time they were committed, I think that was when the battle was already going south for the defenders. So, like I said, fairly sterling effort that from the defenders. It was always going to be a bit of an uphill struggle, and the time limit was not quite reached, but it could have been. I feel as though with a few tweaks, the defenders could very well have met at least one of the victory conditions here, but in the end, the overwhelming force of the attackers, too much for the defenders. So yeah, big thank you to Horton for sending this one in. Big thanks to the Flame of Arnor as well for running this battle and recording the replay as well so that I could show it. So a bit of a joint effort there from those two. And of course a big thank you as well to all the players for being a part of it as well and allowing it to happen. It's the sort of thing which is keeping the channel going until the new patch comes out, as I've said several times. So very important, these sorts of battles to me, that they continue to happen. As far as what's going to be coming next, I don't know, because once again this is one of the replays that I'm doing, which is essentially as I get them I will do them. You know, because I'm now running about a month and a half ahead of time, so I'm recording this like right at the beginning of February essentially. And yeah, it's like that now, so it gives me a good amount of margin for error, which is going to be important one way or another, I think, because I am going to be dipping into that time that I have built up at some stage, and it may be for more than one reason. There's a lot of things which could end up happening here at the start of this year. It's not exactly the start of 2023 I was hoping for, but it's the sort of thing which I feel like maybe will be extrapolated upon in either a YouTube community post or a channel update at some point, because at some stage something is going to have to give, and yeah, something's going to take effect. In the long run it might be a good thing, might not be. It's this, as I've mentioned before, these sorts of things probably aren't going to have too much of an impact on the channel, and in many ways the schedule of the channel and the amount of videos per week and the kind of content probably going to remain pretty much the same, and no one's really going to notice too much of a difference. But I think context is still going to be important, because there's always the chance that things will need to change up at some point, and it's important that I think people know why if that does end up being the case. But I did mention the type of content. To be fair, when the new patch comes out, I would go back to doing like faction overviews and sort of an overview of the new patch as well. It gives me a chance to go back to my roots a little bit and reset the channel a little bit, which I do think it is kind of in need of at this point. I think it's been in survival mode for a fairly long time at this point, just sort of going through the motions and doing the same thing, constantly looking to the horizon, hoping that the new patch would come out. And yeah, we're very much running on fumes at this point, hoping that will happen, because I think something new is needed. And as much as these new battles do sort of allow me to keep going, it is very much the new patch that is needed, although the thing that I was just mentioning with regards to things maybe taking an impact on the channel is completely separate to that. So there are those two separate issues of kind of stagnation of content, and hopefully the new patch arriving will allow me to, again, like I said, reset my channel. And then there's all the stuff going on like in my actual personal life, which I won't go into the details of, but these are the sorts of things which may affect stuff like the ability to record and all of that. I mean, it's kind of all over the place at the moment, and I'm still not sure how it will be resolved. In fact, by the time this video comes out, there's a good chance it will have been resolved one way or another, and clarity will have been established. But until then, I'm not sure. So I guess I'll see you then for that. But yeah, anyway, enough of my waffling. This is just kind of useless information at this point. But like I said, big thank you to Horton and Flame of Arnor and all the players. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.